Hey, Facebook. Happy Friday.
Hey, everybody. It's good to see you.
Thank you for being with us. If you were with us yesterday, you'll notice same clothing.
Our outfits have not changed.
I have to leave early for a football game. Michael's out of the office today. We're both out of the office this afternoon. And so we are pre-recording this study, but we are grateful that you're joining us for it. And we hope that in our time together, there'll be something useful today. I think it's an interesting part of Mark, a meaningful story, a deep story. So we're grateful that you're a part of it today.
Yeah, we come to our Friday study, and on this Friday, we're going to finish chapter 4. So believe it or not, we are making headway here as we make our way through the Gospel of Mark, and we're transitioning out of what was very much a teaching section into a more narrative section where we're going to see a lot more of Jesus doing things as opposed to him teaching as we did. So we are going to see a little bit of a change of pace today.
Yeah, I think Mark tends to chunk things together, and so we had Jesus telling parables and interpreting parables. Now we get into some stories of Jesus both doing miraculous things and specifically some healings, and as is kind of typical, Mark often puts the biggest events last in some ways, although I would argue that really all of the things we're going to encounter in the next few days are all pretty big, and Mark intends them all to be pretty impressive, I think.
Well, let's just jump right into it. We are going to start here in Mark chapter 4, verse 35.
On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let's go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But Jesus was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up, and he rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And then they were filled with great awe, and they said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Michael, a familiar story. I think a very visual kind of story. I think anybody who, in the Midwest, there's virtually no one who hasn't been through a storm. Maybe we haven't been on a boat while it happened. But the idea of a storm coming up and some of the fear that goes with that of being caught out in it, the wind, in this case, the waves that would accompany the wind. There's sort of something kind of visceral about this. And I think it's not both at a literal level and then, of course, at a spiritual level, it's not hard to resonate with the idea that the disciples are afraid.
Right. Clint, if you were going to sort of pick stories, this is one of my favorite stories in the Gospel of Mark, and it would be hard to probably nail down exactly why, but there's something about that contrast between the disciples literally fearing for their lives and then on the other hand, Jesus, who's asleep. And, to those who've heard that story numerous times, that may seem old or that may seem simple. But Clint, it's not. This is an amazing testament to Jesus's authority, such that he is in the middle of what is to everyone around him a potentially life-ending situation. And Jesus has so little concern. He's so confident in his call, in his ability, in who he is and what he is able to do, that he's asleep. And it, for me, I think is another way of addressing a theme that we've seen already so many times, Jesus' authority put against other people's authority. I mean, that's the exact thing that the disciples ask. Who then is this? I mean, another way of saying that is, what kind of person could control the wind and the sea? And of course, Mark wants us all to be on the inside and know, well, the Jesus kind of person. The Son of God could do that. But it's not apparent to those who are with them. And I just find this story rich on so many different levels.
One of the great things about this story and the way that Mark tells it is it has layers. It has lots of what I kind of consider jumping off points. And what I mean by that is I think there are, as a preaching text, there are just so many invitations in this. You know, I'm not a boat person. I've been in boats. I don't mind boats, but when you see the videos of those boats out on the sea that are facing waves that are 2 or 3 times taller than the boat itself, I'm out. I want no part of that. But the idea of being afraid, the idea of being caught in one of the storms of life and feeling like you can't get your breath, you can't get to shore, you can't navigate, it's dark, it's windy, it's scary. I think whether or not you've ever been on a lake, everybody can relate to that kind of experience at some level. And also, I think in that moment, you can kind of imagine that the disciples look to Jesus and he's sacked out in the back on the cushion. By the way, the back is normally where I think you would steer, and he's not interested. He's not involved. There's a sense in which he's absent, not physically absent, but he's not joining them in their predicament, which is the good news, but they don't know that yet. And I think many of us have been in a moment where we felt swamped by life, and we look around and we say, okay, Jesus, why aren't you here? And what we mean is, Jesus, why don't you join me in being wound up and panicked? And how come you're not worried like I am? Don't you care? And the incredible thing about Jesus is he never reflects our anxiety. He's asleep, but it's not the sleep of disinterest. He simply doesn't have the fear that we so often carry with us.
Yeah, and that's exactly the place where Jesus goes. In verse 40, he says to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" He puts this fear in contrast to faith. And isn't that so often where we find ourselves, both as individuals and also as churches and denominations even, when we allow fear to take up residence in our hearts? It really forecloses upon our ability to exercise faith in the one who promises to be with us, right? Because all it took was waking up Jesus, and like that, the storm was stilled. In fact, the text goes so far as to say there was a dead calm. Notice the disciples didn't die, the storm did, right? So who won? Well, of course we know, Jesus did. But we miss the reality that when we are caught in that cycle of fear and anxiety and rumination and, oh no, what's going to happen? It's actually eating into our time and spirit ability to put trust and faith in the one who is with us. And, you know, another layer, as you say, Clint, in this story is that so often as we ask, where are you, God, in the midst of difficult circumstances, if we would but be willing to give up some of that fear, we might find that he's already with us in the boat.
Yeah, and I can't help but read this. When Jesus says the words, "Peace, be still," Mark says he's speaking to the wind and the sea. But in my mind, I imagine him looking at the disciples. That is a word for them and for us. And Michael, we so often embody what the disciples assume here, that in order for us to have internal peace, there has to first be external peace. And I think the power of this story is that Jesus examples just the opposite, that peace begins internal and you bring it to your external world. You don't get the peace of Christ from your circumstances. You bring it to your circumstance, having first gotten it from Jesus. And in its own way, that's terrifying. One of the things that always makes me smile about this text is that the disciples, it's the same, I believe it's the same word here, they're filled with great awe. The Greek word there is terror, that they're terrified. So they're now at least as afraid of Jesus as they were the storm. And the idea there is sometimes there was a pastor who said it as well as it can be said. We often prefer the misery we know to the mystery we don't. And I think it's fascinating here that the disciples go from being afraid to being afraid, but for different reasons. And really, in fairness to Mark and to the Greek here, awe is probably the right translation, because they're not afraid of Jesus, but they don't encounter that kind of peace, that kind of power, that kind of authority. It silences them. Not only has it silenced the storm, it has silenced them. And they say to one another, "Who is this?" Mm-hmm. And these are the closest people to him. And this is, again, a wonderful moment when we look at Jesus, who we think we know, the Jesus who loves our enemies or forgives people who have done things to us, or whatever moment it is where Jesus is bigger than we thought he was. And we ask the question again, who is this? And those are ripe moments of our faith and powerful ones.
You know, Clint, if there's any lack in modern Christianity, this question may help us see it. We would all do well to ask this question, who then is this, more often? And that's a really helpful, I think, interpretive tool when you're studying Scripture, is it's good to take on yourself the questions of those who are in the text. Mm-hmm. Here, who then is this, is a question we would all do very well to reflect upon. Because when we treat Jesus like a good guy with some good ideas, we have not understood the gravity of who Mark wants us to know Jesus is. In fact, notice the very people who ask at the end of the story, who then is this? How do they address Jesus in the middle of the story? They call him teacher. They say, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Well, I mean, teacher, come on, get up, work on the, help us oar here, or, get the sail, do something, teacher. And that in its very self proves the point that they have no clue who he is. Jesus isn't going to get up and oar. He's just going to tell the boat, he's going to tell the wind and the sea to be calm, right? Who is this is a question that I think all of us need to ask, because whoever we think Jesus is today, we've not seen or know the fullness of who he truly is and who he invites us to know him to be. And, I just think the disciples thought they were talking to a guy who knew stuff and was teaching them the right way. And they were off by about a mile. And they ended up with this question that is, I think, reflective of all of our lives. Who is Jesus really? Who is he not just to us, but who is he in reality? And what does that mean for my life? And we would all do well to ask that question seriously.
Yeah, and certainly that's a step on the journey from teacher to Lord. And, they're moving slowly in Mark, moving that direction. I think there's an encouragement that this story leaves us with, Michael, and I agree. This is one of the great stories. It's for not very long. It's deep, very rich. Never mistake quiet from Jesus as disinterest, when it is probably more likely that Jesus simply isn't joining you in your fear. The disciples assume that because Jesus isn't afraid, he doesn't care, when the reality is Jesus isn't afraid because he's Jesus and he has no reason to be afraid. Mm-hmm. And he's inviting them, he's offering them that opportunity. Don't be afraid. Have you no faith? Why are you afraid? And faith and fear, in the Gospels, faith and fear are in this constant battle. And if you can picture the balance beam, whenever you have more of one, you inevitably have less of the other. They're always opposed to one another. It's funny, the Gospels don't really do a lot with faith and doubt. It's faith and fear that are often put against one another. And so Jesus says, when you have faith, you have no reason to be afraid. And I think it's a wonderful invitation that this text gives us.
Yeah, I think that all of us would do well to simply open this. Even just having a screen behind us, I think doesn't really help. I think the best way to encounter a text like this is to open your Bibles, to turn to Mark chapter 4:35, and just to read this story. And don't just read it like you read the newspaper, where you just try to get through it to hear a story. Really slow down, pay attention, notice the details, put yourself in the boat as it's being rocked. Put yourself in Jesus's seat as he knows what's happening and the disciples don't. Consider this schism between who the disciples think Jesus is and who he actually is. And then I think what Mark would ask is to not only put yourself into this story, but to consider how might it change your life if this was true. If you experienced this and saw the Lord of the wind and seas, how might that change your life today? Might it make you more grateful? Might it make you more faithful? Might it encourage you to practice humility in your own estimation? Whatever that might be for you, I think this text is both illuminating of who Jesus is, but as Mark is a master at doing, it creates this whole opportunity to reflect upon what it might demand of us as we seek to be people of faith.
And there are times I think that Mark is more interested in asking you the question, who is this, in regard to Jesus, than telling you the answer.
Yeah.
And I think if this story delivers us to that final question and we join the disciples in asking, who is this, then we are paying attention and we are right where Mark wants us as we move into chapter 5.
Yeah, and we really need that, Clint, because as we move to chapter 5 on Monday, this is a huge transition in terms of themes. This is a challenging text that we're going to encounter in chapter 5, and I think that very much we're beginning to see some of Jesus's ministry really continue to expand, and we're getting a bigger vision of how significant his incarnation and his lordship really is.
Yeah, we're going to get larger stories, at least more detailed stories than we've seen so far. And so we hope you'll join us next week as we move into chapter 5. We hope there's been something today that's been helpful, and we're grateful that you all have been with us. We hope that you have a great weekend, and we appreciate your time.
See you on Monday, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this daily Bible study. If this is your first time, welcome. We are so glad that you have joined us for this time of intentional study of God's Word. You will find in the description of this video a link to our website. We would love to get to know who you are. We'd love to reach out and greet you personally, but be sure, whether or not this is your first time, to like this video. If you're on Facebook, share it so that other people might be able to find it too. If you're on YouTube, consider subscribing. You'll receive more content like this every day at 2 o'clock Central Standard Time. On top of that, every Wednesday at 9 o'clock, we release a Pastor Talk podcast, which goes through different series, but all of them about faith and life and discipleship of Jesus Christ. Friends, regardless of how many times you've been with us, we hope that this day has been meaningful for you as you seek to follow Jesus Christ. So until next time, be blessed. We look forward to seeing you soon.